Victoria Sterling never imagined that an evening at Le Bernardin would turn her world upside down. The youngest millionaire in New York was dining with business partners when she spotted a familiar man at the corner table. It was James Mitchell, the housekeeper who had worked in her Manhattan penthouse for 3 years. But what she witnessed horrified her. The well-dressed man across from James stood up laughing after seeing the check, leaving him alone with just $5 in his pocket to pay for a $150 dinner. It was a blind date set up through a dating app, and James had just suffered the cruelest humiliation of his life. As the man walked away mockingly, James sat there with tears in his eyes, staring at a bill he couldn't afford. Victoria, who knew him as the most honest and kind worker she'd ever met, felt something break inside her heart. What she did in the next few minutes would change both their lives forever, proving that sometimes true love is born from the most unexpected gestures. Victoria Sterling had everything a 29-year-old woman could desire. Heir to the Sterling empire spanning luxury real estate to high-end fashion, she owned penthouses in Manhattan, houses in the Hamptons, dream cars, and jewelry worth fortunes. But that November evening, sitting at the finest restaurant in New York, she felt emptier than ever. She was dining with business partners to discuss acquiring a hotel chain, but her mind wandered elsewhere. Around her moved attentive waiters. The atmosphere was refined. The dishes were works of art. Yet everything seemed artificial to her, lacking human warmth. That's when she saw him. In the opposite corner of the restaurant, sitting at a table for two, was James Mitchell. Recognition was immediate. This 32-year-old man had worked as a housekeeper in her penthouse for 3 years. Tall, with brown hair and kind eyes, James had always been the perfect employee. Punctual, discreet, efficient. He never spoke about himself, did his work silently, and left without disturbing anyone. Victoria observed him with curiosity. James wore a dark suit that, while not expensive, gave him elegance. His hair was carefully styled, and he had a nervous expression on his face. Across from him sat a man in his 40s, disheveled-looking, who gestured animatedly while talking on his phone. James kept checking his watch, sipped water in small amounts, and smiled politely when the other man addressed him. Victoria realized she was witnessing a date, probably arranged through one of those popular dating apps. The man across from James seemed completely disinterested. He spent more time on his phone than conversing, ordered expensive dishes without consulting the menu, and treated the waiters with arrogance. James, in contrast, was kind to everyone, thanked them for every small service, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know his companion. Victoria looked away for a few minutes, focusing on her business conversation. When she looked back toward James's table, the scene she saw left her petrified. The waiter had just brought the check. The elegant man took it, looked at it, and burst into contemptuous laughter. He got up from the table, took his jacket, and with a sneer on his face, said something to James that made him pale. Then he left, leaving James alone at the table with the check in his hand. Victoria saw James open his wallet and count the money he had. A few bills that clearly weren't nearly enough to cover the expense. The expression on his face was pure desperation. He looked around seeking a solution, his eyes filling with held-back tears. In that moment, Victoria understood she was witnessing one of the cruelest humiliations a human being could suffer. James, the man who for 3 years had cared for her home with dedication and respect, had been deliberately put in an impossible situation by someone who clearly enjoyed playing with others' feelings. Without even realizing it, Victoria stood up from her table. Her partners looked at her surprised, but she didn't care. She crossed the restaurant with determined steps, her heart beating fast for what she was about to do. When she reached James's table, he looked up. Recognition was immediate, followed by a wave of shame that colored his cheeks. She was the last person in the world he would have wanted to find him in that situation. James immediately stood up, stammering confused apologies. But Victoria stopped him with a gesture and, naturally, sat in the place the other man had just left empty. What she said and did in the following minutes would forever change how both perceived each other, opening a completely new chapter in their lives. James stood beside the table, mortified beyond imagination. Of all the people who could have witnessed his humiliation, it had to be his employer, the only person he depended on economically, the only one who could fire him with a simple word. Victoria looked at him with an expression he had never seen before. There was no judgment in her eyes, no superiority. There was something that resembled understanding, perhaps even compassion. Without saying a word, Victoria took the check from James's trembling hands and examined it. $150 for a dinner he hadn't even wanted to order. The other man had deliberately chosen the most expensive dishes, knowing perfectly well what he was doing. James began stammering explanations. It was his first date in years. He had thought he'd finally met someone special through the app. The man had written to him for weeks, seemed interested, intelligent, mature. He had proposed meeting at that restaurant, saying he would pay. James never imagined it was a cruel trap. Victoria listened in silence, seeing a side of James she didn't know. For 3 years, she had dealt with a perfect but distant employee. Now she had before her a vulnerable, wounded man experiencing one of the most difficult moments of his life. When James finished explaining, Victoria did something completely unexpected. She called the waiter and ordered a bottle of the house's finest champagne. Then she addressed James with a decisive but gentle tone. She told him to sit down, not as an employee to his employer, but as person to person. She wanted to hear his story, understand who the man really was, whom she had seen for 3 years only as a silent presence in her house. James sat slowly, still incredulous about what was happening. Victoria paid the check without even looking at it, as if $150 were pocket change. But her gesture went far beyond money. She was saving James's dignity, allowing him to leave that situation with his head held high. While they waited for the champagne, Victoria began asking questions. She wanted to know about his life, his dreams, what he did in his free time. James answered with initial hesitation, then with growing openness. He discovered that behind that apparent security of a rich and powerful woman, Victoria had genuine curiosity about people. James told her about his literature degree, the teaching job he had to leave for economic problems, the sick mother he cared for in his spare time. He explained that working as a housekeeper wasn't his dream, but it was honest work that allowed him to support himself and help his family. Victoria listened fascinated. She had never imagined James was so cultured, so sensitive. He spoke of books with passion, of art with competence, of music with deep knowledge. He was a man who had to hide his true nature to adapt to the role circumstances had imposed on him. The champagne arrived, and Victoria proposed a toast, not to the disastrous evening James had experienced, but to the possibility of truly getting to know each other for the first time. James drank a sip and felt something strange happen inside him. For the first time in years, someone was seeing him for what he really was, not for the job he did. The conversation flowed naturally for over an hour. Victoria discovered that James had subtle humor, vast culture, a sensitivity she rarely encountered in men from her world. James, for his part, saw a woman completely different from what he had imagined. Victoria wasn't just rich and powerful. She was intelligent, curious, and surprisingly lonely. When they finally got up to leave, both knew something had changed irreversibly. They were no longer employer and employee. They were two people who had truly met for the first time, discovering they had much more in common than they had ever imagined. Victoria accompanied James to the subway station. Before saying goodbye, she told him she wanted to continue that conversation. Not in the penthouse, not in their work relationship, but as people. James accepted, still incredulous about what was happening in his life. That night, both stayed awake for a long time, thinking about the evening. James couldn't believe that the richest woman he knew had sat with him, listened to him, treated him as an equal. Victoria, for her part, realized she had spent one of the most interesting evenings in years. Neither imagined this was just the beginning of a story that would change both their lives in ways they could never have predicted. The days following that evening were different for both. James continued working in Victoria's penthouse, as always, but now there was an electric tension in the air. They exchanged fleeting glances, barely hinted smiles, words that hid much more. Victoria began observing James with new eyes. She noticed how he handled the books in her library with reverence, how he arranged flowers with artistic taste, the delicacy with which he cleaned art objects. He demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond that of a simple domestic worker. One evening she found him in the library, absorbed in reading a volume of Whitman with underlined pages. For the first time, Victoria allowed herself to speak with him outside their formal work relationship. James became animated, telling her about his passion for literature, revealing a deep understanding born from years of study. That conversation lasted for hours. Victoria discovered that James had written literary articles, knew 5 languages, played piano. It was a world she had never suspected existed in that silent man. The evenings together became a habit. They talked about books, art, music, philosophy. Victoria realized that many of her ideas were influenced by those conversations, even though James didn't realize it. When Victoria proposed he accompany her to a concert at Lincoln Center, James hesitated. He was aware of social differences, the gossip that would ensue, but she insisted. She wanted to share that experience with someone who could truly understand it. The concert was a revelation. James demonstrated knowledge of classical music that impressed Victoria. He commented on performances with competence, recognized styles and techniques. For her, it was experiencing culture in a new way, no longer as status symbol, but as a source of authentic pleasure. On the way back, James told her about his dream of returning to teaching, of opening a school for less fortunate kids. Victoria listened, fascinated, seeing the passion in his eyes. When they arrived at the penthouse, they sat in the garden under the stars. Victoria confessed her loneliness, despite being surrounded by people. James told her that since they had started truly talking, he realized how much he had missed a real human connection. In that moment, they understood something profound was happening between them. It was no longer just friendship, but something more intense that both frightened and attracted them. That night, both knew they had crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back. The following weeks were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. James continued working in the penthouse, but his relationship with Victoria was completely transformed.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
There was electric tension between them, made of seeking glances, conversations lasting hours, silences full of meaning. Victoria found herself attracted to a man not for status or wealth, but for intelligence, sensitivity, and authenticity. James represented everything missing from her world: genuineness, depth, true values. James struggled with feelings that grew every day. He was in love with Victoria, but knew how complicated their situation was. She belonged to a world of privileges that seemed unreachable for someone like him. The turning point came during a rainy December evening. Victoria had canceled all commitments and asked James to stay after work. She wanted to cook together with him, something she had never done. The idea of preparing food with her own hands seemed incredibly attractive. James guided her in preparing risotto with porcini mushrooms, teaching her traditional cooking secrets. She had fun like a child, laughing at her mistakes. While cooking, their hands touched, their bodies drew closer. There was an intimacy that went far beyond friendship. They dined in the kitchen, at the rustic table normally reserved for staff. For Victoria, it was an absolute novelty, but with James, everything seemed natural. They talked about travel, dreams, fears, hopes for the future. It was during that dinner that James found courage to express his feelings. He told her he had fallen in love with her, but understood if she couldn't reciprocate. Their lives were too different, their worlds too distant. Victoria looked at him in silence, then confessed she had also fallen in love. With him, his intelligence, the way he made her feel like a woman instead of just rich. For the first time, she had met a man who loved her for what she really was. The first kiss came spontaneously, sweet and full of everything they had said in previous weeks. Social differences, practical problems disappeared. There were only two people who had found each other against all odds. The following days were the happiest either had ever lived. They sought every excuse to be together, to share intimate moments. James formally continued working for Victoria, but they lived a love story that filled them with joy. With James, Victoria felt free to be spontaneous, to laugh, to talk about her true feelings. James flourished under her love. His self-esteem grew. His culture found a worthy interlocutor. His dreams seemed achievable, but they knew they couldn't live forever in that bubble of happiness. Sooner or later, they would have to face the outside world, which would hardly accept their relationship. One evening, embracing on the library sofa, Victoria made a revolutionary decision. She was tired of hiding. She wanted to present James to the world as the man she loved, whatever the consequences. James looked at her with love and concern. He knew how much Victoria was risking, but also knew she was right. If their love was true, it had to be strong enough to resist any storm. Victoria's decision to make their relationship public unleashed an earthquake in her social world. The news that the richest heiress in America had fallen in love with her housekeeper spread through New York in hours, becoming the main topic in high society salons. Reactions were immediate and cruel. Family friends called scandalized, business partners questioned her mental stability, gossip magazines began speculating about a possible nervous breakdown or a plan by James to take over her fortune. James lived this period with a mix of pride and torment. He was happy Victoria had the courage to declare herself publicly, but suffered seeing her attacked and judged for a choice of love. Some of Victoria's friends had confronted him directly, offering him money to disappear from her life, accusing him of being an unscrupulous fortune hunter. Social pressure was enormous. Victoria received constant pressure from her extended family, board members of her companies, legal advisors. Everyone urged her to come to her senses before it was too late, to protect the family patrimony from what they saw as a dangerous opportunist. But Victoria resisted with determination. She had found true love for the first time in her life and wasn't willing to give it up to satisfy social conventions. In fact, the criticism and attacks only strengthened her determination. She realized how superficial and empty the world she had grown up in was. To demonstrate the seriousness of her intentions, Victoria did something revolutionary. She offered James the position of director of a new foundation she wanted to create for educating less fortunate youth. It was a role that would value his culture and passion for teaching, allowing him to realize dreams he had to set aside. James accepted enthusiastically, but set conditions. He wanted the foundation to be truly independent, for him to earn the position through merit and not personal relationships with Victoria. He wanted to prove to the world, but especially to himself, that he was capable of being worthy of that responsibility. The months that followed were challenging, but exhilarating. James threw himself heart and soul into the foundation project, developing innovative educational programs, finding the best teachers, creating a structure that could truly make a difference in young people's lives. His competence and passion quickly won the respect of all collaborators. Victoria discovered a new dimension of her wealth. Instead of spending money on useless luxuries, she was investing it in something that could concretely change people's lives. Seeing James realize his dreams, seeing the first kids benefit from foundation programs, gave her satisfaction she had never felt before. Slowly, even public opinion began to change. The foundation's results spoke for themselves, and James proved to be much more than a simple opportunist. His newspaper interviews revealed a cultured, passionate person with a clear vision of how to improve society through education. The decisive moment came during the Foundation's first graduation ceremony. 20 kids from difficult families had completed an intensive study program that prepared them for university access. Their thank you speeches, families' tears of joy, teachers' emotion showed everyone that what James and Victoria were doing together had value that went far beyond social conventions. That evening, during the celebration party, Victoria watched James talking with the kids who had completed the program. She saw happiness in his eyes, the satisfaction of someone who had finally found their place in the world. She realized their love story had not only changed their lives, but was having a positive impact on society itself. When James reached her, he took her hand in front of everyone present. They no longer hid, no longer feared others' judgment. Their love had passed the most difficult test, that of time and concrete reality. That night, embracing in the penthouse garden, both knew they had won their battle, not only against social prejudices, but against their own fears and insecurities. They had proven that true love can really overcome any barrier when supported by mutual respect, shared values, and the will to build something beautiful together. 2 years after that evening at the restaurant that changed everything, James and Victoria married in a ceremony that became a symbol of how love can break down every social barrier. The Church of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York was packed with people representing all the worlds they had managed to unite, from New York high society to foundation kids, from university professors to humble families, from working neighborhoods. James, elegant in a tailored suit, waited for Victoria at the altar with emotion he couldn't hide. When she entered the church, radiant in a simple but refined silk dress, everyone's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't just a wedding. It was the celebration of a story that had taught many that true love knows no class differences. The foundation they had created together had become a model for all America. Hundreds of kids had completed educational programs. Many had succeeded in accessing the best universities. Others had started small businesses or become teachers themselves. James was recognized as one of the most brilliant innovators in social education. Victoria had completely transformed her approach to business. Instead of focusing only on profit, she had oriented all her companies toward social and environmental sustainability. She had become an example of how wealth can be a tool for positive transformation of society. But the real revolution had occurred in their private lives. James had discovered he was a natural leader, capable of inspiring and guiding other people toward noble goals. His self-esteem had grown enormously, not for the money he now earned, but for awareness of making a difference in many young people's lives. Victoria had finally found deep meaning in her existence. She was no longer the bored, rich heiress who spent fortunes on whims, but an engaged woman, a loving wife, a person who used her privileges to help those in need. Their love had matured, becoming even deeper. They had overcome together criticism, judgments, practical difficulties of two worlds meeting. They had learned to be a team, to support each other, to share not only beautiful moments, but also responsibilities and concerns. One evening, 3 months after the wedding, they sat in the penthouse library that was now truly their home. James was correcting projects from some foundation kids. Victoria was reading her company's financial statements. They worked in silence, but it was a silence full of complicity and love. When they looked up from their documents and smiled at each other, both thought back to that evening at the restaurant that had started everything. James remembered the terrible humiliation of being abandoned with a bill he couldn't pay. Victoria thought of the impulse that had pushed her to get up from her table to help a man she barely knew. That spontaneous gesture had triggered a chain reaction that had transformed not only their lives, but also those of hundreds of other people. They had proven that authentic love is a revolutionary force, capable of breaking down prejudices, changing perspectives, creating opportunities where before there was only mental closure. James got up and went to Victoria, who put down her documents and took his hands. In that simple and perfect moment, they felt once again the magic of what they had built together. They were no longer the housekeeper and the millionaire. They were James and Victoria, two people who had chosen to love each other and use their love to make the world a better place. The next evening, they received a phone call that filled them with joy. One of the first kids they had helped through the foundation had just won a scholarship to study medicine at Harvard. He had grown up in an immigrant family, had faced every possible difficulty, but James's educational program had transformed him into a brilliant student. That phone call confirmed what both felt in their hearts. Their love wasn't just a beautiful romantic story, it had become a tool for social change. They had taken the best from both their worlds, James's culture and sensitivity, Victoria's resources and determination, and put it at the service of those who needed it most. As they fell asleep embracing that night, as every other for 2 years, James and Victoria knew they had found not only the love of their lives, but also the deep meaning of their existence. They had proven that when two people truly love each other and unite their forces, they can move mountains and change the destiny of many other lives. Theirs had been much more than love at first sight or a modern fairy tale. It had been proof that true love has the power to transform everything it touches, creating beauty, opportunities, and hope, where before there were only loneliness, prejudices, and resignation. Like if you believe true love can overcome any social difference. Comment which moment of the story touched you most. Share to inspire those who still believe in authentic love. Subscribe for more stories of hearts that meet against all odds. Sometimes a gesture of kindness in a difficult moment can change two lives forever. Sometimes the most beautiful love is born when you least expect it, and where you least look for it. And sometimes two seemingly different people can discover they are perfect for each other. Because true love doesn't look at your bank account, but at your heart account.